let's look at how we use our tools to analyze the effects of policies that drive a wedge between supply and demand. We'll look at specifically a sales tax, a specific tax on a good, and a price floor. A price floor is where the government guarantees that the price won't fall below some particular price. Let's call it P bar. So what these are going to do are to drive a wedge between the price that the consumers pay and the marginal cost. And that's going to cause a deadweight loss. So let's start with our specific tax. So let's suppose the government imposes a specific tax tau per unit on a good. That's going to cause the consumers to have to pay more, so there's going to be a reduction in consumer surplus. It's also going to reduce the price that the firms receive. So there's going to be a reduction in the producer surplus. You can go back to chapter 2 and you'll remember that both the consumers and the producers are going to bear parts of the tax. However, though the consumer and the producers are going to suffer some loss, the government is going to raise some revenue, and we'll represent that revenue by delta T. So that's tax revenue that the government raises. And we should include that in our welfare calculations. So the change in welfare, delta W, is the change in consumer surplus plus the change in producer surplus plus the revenue that the government generates. So the question you want to ask here is this government revenue going to offset the loss in producer and consumer surpluses? So let's see if that happens. Without any government intervention, in particular without any tax, we're going to end up at this competitive equilibrium, P1Q1. So the consumer surplus is just going to be the area below the demand curve and above the price, P1. So it's this area here. And the producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price, P1. So it's this triangle down here. So the consumer surplus is areas A, B, and C. And the producer surplus is areas D, E, and F. That's what we've got in this first column here. So the total welfare is just the sum of these two, which is A, B, and C for the consumers, D, E, and F for the producers. So it's A, B, C, D, E, and F. That's the total welfare. Now let's look at what happens with the tax in place. The supply curve is going to shift upwards by tau, by the amount of the tax. That's something we've seen in chapter 2. So we're going to go from the equilibrium quantity Q1 to some quantity Q2, which is lower than Q1. The price that the consumers pay is going to increase from P1 to P2, and the producers are going to have to return tau dollars out of every unit that they sell to the government as a tax. So the price that they receive is going to be P2 minus tau. This distance here, this difference between the price that the consumers pay and the price that the suppliers receive, is tau. And if the tax has been imposed, Q2 units are sold, then the tax revenue is going to be the number of units sold times the tax. So that is going to be given by this area of this rectangle. The consumer surplus after the change, after the imposition of this tax, is just this area A. It's the area below the demand curve, above the price P2 that the consumers pay. The producer surplus is the area above the supply curve, but below the price that the suppliers receive, which is P2 minus tau. So it's this area F. So we can fill in this last column with the consumer surplus of A, the producer surplus of F, the tax revenue of B plus D, which is the area of that rectangle. So the total welfare is just A plus F plus B plus D. So now we can calculate the deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is the welfare without the policy minus the welfare with the policy. And what's lost is the areas C and E. And so that's our deadweight loss. Now, what we see here is that the tax is going to lower the total welfare, even though we've accounted for the revenue that we've taken in. And the reason is because at the new equilibrium, the buyers are willing to pay more than the marginal cost, what it costs the producers to produce. So we should have more output to increase welfare. So this tax prevents the quantity from being high enough. And because of that, society is quote-unquote worse off. Now, I should emphasize here that we're not taking into account other goals of the tax. For example, if you had a policy of taxing cigarettes because cigarettes are causing people to be unhealthy, and there was actually a gain to society from having people smoke fewer cigarettes, that's not accounted for here. But this is still giving you some way of measuring the welfare of the producers and the consumers. And so these losses have to be accounted for in the cost and benefit of a policy. And then you can add to that the benefit from whatever the reduction in consumption of this good is. The next type of policy we want to look at are price floors. In some markets, the government imposes a price floor saying that the price can't fall below that particular price. I believe there's a price floor on milk in most markets in Canada. So how does the government implement this policy? Well, they ensure that if the market price falls below P bar, then the government will buy up as much of the output as necessary to drive the price back up to P lower bar. It's not uncommon in agricultural markets, and we see them in many countries. Buying these extra units of output costs the government a certain amount. So there's delta X as the cost of this policy. So that has to be accounted for in the welfare calculation. So the welfare calculation includes the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and what the government has to spend on buying up the extra units of the good. Let's do an example. Let's suppose we have a demand function. So d of p is 10 minus a half p. And we have a supply function, which is there's 0 units supplied at any price less than 2, and at the prices 2 and higher, it's p minus 2. And let's suppose the price floor is at $12. We'll do the same thing. We'll look at what happens before and after the price floor is implemented. Without a price floor, the equilibrium is P1, Q1, and we can calculate that. We set supply equal to demand. So this is our demand, this is our supply. We set them equal to one another. And if we solve for P, we find that the equilibrium price is 8. And so we plug that into the supply function to find that the equilibrium quantity is 6. So at this quantity of 6 and price of 8, we can look at what the producer and consumer surplus are, and therefore what the total welfare is. Of course, the government's not spending anything because this policy doesn't exist in this benchmark. So the consumer surplus is the area above the price, below the demand curve. So it's this stuff here, and that's comprised of this area A, B, and C. That's what we've got here. The producer surplus is this lower triangle here, area above the supply curve, below the price of 8. So that's areas E plus F. That's what we've got here. So the total surplus is A plus B plus C plus E plus F. If we did the calculations, we would find that the consumer surplus is 36, the producer surplus is 18, the government is of course not spending anything, and therefore the total surplus is 54, which is the sum of these two. Let's see what happens with the price floor. The price floor, remember, is 12. So the government has agreed to provide the producers with a price of $12. And so if the price is $12, the producers are going to supply 10 units. We just plug that into our supply function. So it's 12 minus 2, so it's 10. At the price of 12, the consumers are only going to demand 4 units. So we have an excess supply situation. There's excess supply of 6 units. Who's buying up these 6 units? The government is. The government's going to spend $12 for each of the 6 units, so they're going to spend a total of $72 on buying up these extra units. So we can represent that all graphically. The producer surplus is now going to be much higher. They're selling 10 units at the price of 12. So the producer surplus is this area. So it's B plus C plus D plus E plus F. What we have here. The consumer surplus is going to be a great deal smaller. They're having to pay a much higher price, and so their surplus is the area below the demand curve but above this high price of 12. So that's just area A. Now we still have to include the expenditure of the government. So the government is going to spend $12, which is the height of this rectangle, on every unit that the consumers don't buy, but the suppliers produce. So suppliers are producing 10 units. The consumers are only buying 4 units. So they buy these units, get bought by the consumers. These remaining units don't get bought. There are 6 of them. So for every one of these 6 units that the consumers don't buy, the government pays $12. So this area G plus C plus F plus D is the government expenditure, which needs to be subtracted from the total welfare. So the total welfare with the tax is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus minus the government expenditures. So what's the consumer surplus? It's A. The producer surplus is B plus C plus D plus E plus F. And what's the government expenditure? We subtract from this C plus D plus F plus G. So we cancel out the C's, D, and F. So if we add those up, we get A plus B plus E minus G. When we compare the total welfare with the price floor versus the total welfare without the price floor, we see that adding the price floor causes us to lose the area C and F as well as G. So the loss of welfare from the price floor is this area right here. It's C plus F plus G. And we can calculate these again. The consumer surplus with the price floor is 16. The producer surplus with the price floor is 50, but the government, recall, is spending $72. So the total welfare is producer surplus of 50 plus consumer surplus of 16 minus the government expenditure of 72, so it's a total of -6. So the deadweight loss is this area here. And we can quantify it as being -60. Now the government's buying up the excess supply to drive up the price. It would be better to just transfer this amount. You could just hand the producers the area B plus C plus D, and you'd have the same net effect without decreasing the consumer surplus or incurring the extra expenditure of G. In fact, this measure of deadweight loss probably underestimates what the actual loss is, because now the government's going to purchase this stuff, it has to be stored, it has to be shipped, and so there's all these extra costs that we're not measuring. So our analysis demonstrates that something like a price floor isn't a very effective policy. Just handing cash directly to the farmers would have been a far better policy. It wouldn't harm the consumers as much, and it would be just as good for the producers without increasing the government expenditure as much as it did.